It's time for something brief. Balancity, or Balancity, or however you feel about it, is a very light indie city building game. Sure, there are plenty of city builders out there, but many just take what works and iterate on it. City Skylines is probably the most popular city builder of the past 5 years, and it's on my shortlist for a future episode, but it can chalk up so much of its success to getting right what 2013 SimCity did so terribly wrong. It's a very iterative genre, but Balancity is different. As its name implies, your job is to build a block-based metropolis on a fulcrum as high as possible without, the whole thing careening into the void. You'll encounter riots and fires and other traditional SimCity-esque disasters along the way, which are implemented pretty well, and you'll need to handle them while keeping your city literally balanced. Now, I say block-based metropolis, but in reality, all of these structures have different sizes and shapes. While offices and apartments are going to be the bricks you need to expand your city, allowing you to unlock new rewards to expand your height limit, you'll need to accommodate for both weirdly shaped structures to both keep the city balanced and ensure you have a stable platform to keep building on. If you've ever worked retail, you know the pressure of having to Tetris a variety of boxy shapes together into a pleasant conformity that doesn't spill over when you move it. The game comes bundled with a variety of locales and scenarios to mix up the gameplay, but you can also take an empty platform and try to build as high as you can. Don't expect multiple cities, you have a single save slot. It's actually a quaint restriction since this is a game meant to be played in a single session. Balancity has a very clever premise, but it doesn't quite have enough bones to keep it humming for the long haul. It's a strategy game in the very loosest sense of the term. This is not a free landscape to paint your expertly designed metropolis onto. You're playing a nuanced version of Jenga. There's no money involved, and beyond the base buildings, there aren't a lot of interlocking components to create stable platforms or multiply your city's growth. Sometimes you'll get lucky enough to lay roads, which can be used as foundations for subsequent tiers, but if you try to freestyle a build by haphazardly placing stuff as you need it, you're gonna be very screwed very fast. The game doesn't have a very strong indication as to when you're about to tip the scale one way or the other, and once your demise begins, it's impossible to reverse. You're just gonna have to watch that city fall over. This becomes especially troublesome when you're trying to be precise with building placement and the game's physics and lack of snapping just don't like to play along. It's hard to know why some apartment buildings will snap together when conditions are good and others won't based on the distance between blocks, or why the elevator shafts required for office skyscrapers don't integrate into the buildings themselves. They look kinda dopey hanging out alone. It appears Fernando Cordova built this with his own 2 hands, and as a single developer indie title, it feels solid technically. I mean, aside from some occasionally wonky physics and a lack of meat in the gameplay department, my biggest gripe may be the aesthetic. Characters don't look great, and when they're in trouble, they blend into the city, making them hard to spot. The landscapes are chunky looking in a way that doesn't do the low-res look much service. The construction menu should be sectioned off into like options without all the crazy button colors, and main menu transitions are super slow. The cheery Maxis-like music is always bombastic, which forced me to shut off the audio entirely after a while. A volume slider would help. I really want to like this game, but there's just not enough, structure here. It feels like the first pass of a design document and no amount of extra content is gonna fix it. It needs more on a fundamental basis. I wish more structures worked and locked together. I wish there was some kind of microgrid. I wish there was a way to build literal infrastructure to support your buildings and transport people. I wish there was more of a simulation happening, or a simulation happening at all. Maybe that defeats the simple purpose of stacking oddly shaped bricks on a perilous plank, but if you're gonna invoke the city builder genre, well, there are expectations to satisfy. It's time for something brief. If it felt Doom needed the Super Meat Boy treatment, the result would be Butcher, a game that clearly advertises from its title screen that the easiest mode is hard. Literally, it's hard, harder, and hardest, and Butcher is absolutely brutal at any rate. In all honesty, I can't even get past the 3rd level, so let's talk up to that point. The game's opening cutscene is cryptic, but you appear to be a mechanical Terminator-esque angry man who's here to butcher the inhabitants of a crippled space station. Maybe. Said inhabitants tend to be extremely hostile based on what I've seen so far, and they live in the darkest, most decrepit spaces, so I'm not quite sure who the real villain is here. I'm sure there's a companion game where a single butcher Terminator dude is killing everyone in your awesome dark space station. There's a hub world here, but I can't tell you anything about it since I've been stuck in the Ironworks facility the entire time I've owned this. This is a hardcore game, and Butcher's first level is the only ramp you're going to get. Just a heads up, you're still going to die. Apparently you can play Butcher with a controller, but I don't know why you'd use anything other than the keyboard and mouse because you need the response time. The quicker you can whip that cursor around the screen, the longer you'll live. Using WASD to get your character across these levels and up and down from platforms, you'll feel like you're twisting fingers trying to catch up with the mayhem your mouse hand is putting you through. I can't tell you how many times I've panicked and descended into a pool of lava trying to escape my prey. You get a chainsaw by default, and the shotgun and assault rifle make themselves available quickly. Dead enemies drop desperately needed ammo, so you'll throw yourself into danger over and over just to be able to kill the next bad guy. If you're left with the chainsaw, you're pretty much screwed. This is a game about dying and restarting quickly. This is a game about hovering inches from your screen, disconnecting from the external world, and becoming one with this murderous landscape. The mechanics are so slick that, like Super Meat Boy, you'll find yourself slide into a groove. You'll also find yourself tire as you fail to progress. This isn't a game I can play for an extended period of time because it's so intense. While Butcher is a game designed for speedrunning, with most of its enemies in predictable positions to take advantage of, it's the elimination arena portions that will try your skills and patience. You'll need to keep eyes up, down, and all around while snapping up every last ammo, health, and shield pickup because you'll end up dead quickly otherwise. Memorization won't help you battle the game's random seed. Your enemies hop between levels and fly, and there's a simple joy in detonating jetpacks for the fireballs alone. You might not find so much joy in murdering the game's hapless civilians to regain health, but you'll probably need it. The game's aesthetic feels drawn almost exclusively from the Doom series, from the dripping start screens of old to the lava-lit levels of the newest reboot. The game is smooth and moves quickly, but is rendered in a tiny resolution, similar to the also brutally difficult roguelike Teleglitch. It's a neat choice, but it also obscures details at times, which can be a pain when the bodies and gore start to pile up. The MIDI-infused industrial soundtrack that combines both eras of Doom is pretty banging too. Even though it shot me up and spit me out, I still have to recommend Butcher, but I don't know how much time I've got left with it. I'm not one to throw all my might at a challenge like a lot of my friends did in the NES era, because that was the only way you could wring the full value out of those games. Butcher requires a level of twitchy response that I just don't have. I'm making the comparison again, but Super Meat Boy did the intense platformer perfectly. Far less stick and far more carrot, the game walked you through each and every mechanic, even if the game focused entirely on mobility, just to make sure you had a firm grasp on how it played. When the game did descend into brutal difficulty, you had all the tools you needed to succeed. Your progress didn't feel like walking a knife edge because it was predictable. For $10, the game's worth a spin at any rate, but if you've got the skills and a penchant for the ultraviolence, you can't go wrong with Butcher. It's time for something brief. Dead Cells is an action platformer Metroidvania roguelike that quickly became my favorite game of last year. If I were judging the game on that pithy description alone, it would have been lost in a sea of indie titles I didn't have time for. But when I saw Dead Cells, I believed it. This game in motion is a ballet of agility and violence unfolding before your very eyes. Its inspired Disney's Aladdin meets gory slasher flick look is fresh. If you're like me and not really interested in action side-scrollers, Dead Cells still stands head and shoulders above the competition. Mechanically, it works for 3 huge reasons. Number 1, it moves. One of Motion Twin's first priorities was making movement and combat satisfying by refining the game's animation, platforming, and action into a buttery smooth, seamless joy for the eyes and fingers. Even watching it in motion isn't enough. Getting your literal hands on this game and moving through its environments elicits a giddiness that I haven't felt since playing Assassin's Creed, whose buttery smooth parkour made that series what it is. Enemies explode into gibs and demonic flame, and your pseudo 2D immortal avatar leaps, slams, and slashes without a hitch. Other visual effects really nail the impact you have on your enemies and the world around you. You play a disembodied head who, at the beginning of each run, drips down into the prisoner's quarters and embodies a new body. As you wander through this colorful world, you find scraps and artifacts of a story about a mutating plate called the Malaise that has fallen over this island. The game doesn't really need a story, but there you go. Number 2, you grow. The last roguelike I put a bunch of time into was 2015's Enter the Gungeon. As much as I loved it, it never felt like I was progressing. I was unlocking tons and tons of wildly creative guns, but few were more powerful than any other, and there weren't many permanent upgrades. Dead Cells takes the opposite tack. Like any roguelike, the whole point is to die over and over and carry that progress between playthroughs. Here you feel progress as your weapon selection expands and improves in quality. By defeating minor bosses, you acquire runes to access previously unreachable sections of the game's randomly generated levels. Along the way, more modes and options become available to play, including a daily challenge that grants exclusive blueprints to throw Dead Cells at. Speaking of which, collecting the game's titular currency from defeated enemies and cashing it in between levels reinforces the notion that you're on a progression treadmill and building to something great even within each run. As you collect and unlock new powers, weapons, and abilities, they appear in a sea of hanging cleaning jars in the game's opening chamber that visually dignifies your hard work. If you get bored cleaning out every last enemy and glowing gimme from every level, the game encourages you to take up speedrunning. There are things you miss along the way, sure, but plenty of rewards unlock between levels if you can get through them quickly enough, and they generally make up for it. Number 3, it's fair. Dead Cells is a fair game. Every hit, injury, and death you suffer is your fault, and it feels great. For example, you can walk past enemies and not take damage. When an enemy does attack, they have a tell indicating what they're going to do, how powerful it'll be, and where you need to stand or roll to avoid them. Obviously, this requires some experience and memorization, but even the spike hazards have a logic to them that makes the game's difficulty a product of hubris or ignorance rather than arbitrary harm from the game itself. It creates a notion that success is based on doing better next time rather than being at the mercy of RNG. Motion Twin has been constantly tweaking and improving the game since it entered early access in 2017. Dead Cells is also the first game I've had the pleasure of playing that was produced by an anarcho-syndical workshop cooperative. If you're not familiar with the French developer's lengthy resume of mobile and browser games, you'd be in the same boat as me, even though they've been around for nearly 20 years. Each of Motion Twin's 10 to 15 employees gets paid the exact same and has the exact same amount of say in each game's development. There are no bosses. It's not a structure that could work for many game developers, but in an era of 100-hour-a-week crunches ahead of a release and massive corporate strategies steering games towards chintzy monetization, Motion Twins and Dead Cells are equally interesting surprises. It's time for something brief. id's new Doom feels like a greatest hits album. I'm not talking about one of those crummy 20th Century Masters compilations that just scrape the singles and cash in, but a body of work that understands the artist's ideas and philosophies and compiles them into an elaborate form that serves as its own logical extension of the artist's work. Considering this game was about to become a Call of Duty clone before Bethesda said no and forced them back to formula, mining their best past work was probably the best option B. Of course, how much you love it is going to depend on how much you enjoy its tropes. With tongue planted firmly in cheek, Doom casts you as legendary Doom Marine who awakens in the midst of a demonic invasion summoned by cult leader Olivia Pierce. UAC Administrator Sam Hayden, who sounds a lot like Peter Cullen and exists inside a robot, is guiding you across this facility to stop her from forging a permanent portal to Hell. When you realize this facility exists to mine energy from Hell as a next-generation power source, it's pretty clear that nothing could have possibly gone wrong. Doom banks on this self-awareness pretty well. If the Doom Marine weren't so belligerent, the story would have been just as grim as Doom 3's. Doom has fairly large levels that are sectioned into temporary arenas where the doors lock and you knock down waves of demonic baddies until the game tells you to stop. If you look just beyond the beaten path, there are also plenty of collectibles. Just like Gremedy's games, sitting still is dangerous, and Doom forces you forward with melee glory kills to regain health after staggering an enemy. The trade-off comes when you get more destructive weapons that tend to blow enemies away before you can sweep in for the recovering kill. Along with never needing to reload your weaponry, these are very clever design choices. From the first moment I saw this game, it looked like a sequel to Doom 3, a technically impressive shooter shrouded in nearly complete darkness. Combined with its slightly non-linear map designs, it's super easy to get lost in Doom's mazes of dark machinery. There's a lot of detail in these levels, and even with the departure of technical genius John Carmack, Doom looks incredibly impressive, although with a pair of 970s in this machine, the frame rate did start to hitch when I got to Hell. Just like the good old days, you're seeking out yellow, blue, and red keys while scrubbing the minimap to find the way forward. But as a kid whose parents didn't let him play Doom in its heyday, I don't have a whole lot of reverence for those good old days. There's also no shortage of platforming, so if you're into that, well, enjoy. This return to formula may have been a good nostalgia play, but it feels like a step back from the open and organic confrontations of their last game, Rage. Then again, I realize I'm one of a handful of people who love that game. I almost didn't give Doom a chance. Spending the first hour with your pea shooter, chasing down nimble imps with a sparsity of ammo for your more effective shotgun isn't fun. In fact, I committed the blasphemy of ditching my keyboard and mouse for my old reliable Xbox 360 controller, and it works out pretty well. The other big issue I have with Doom is that it feels a lot like the campaign I played 12 years ago with the same fuzzy industrial soundtrack. Sure, the moment-to-moment action and engine under the hood are different, but it feels like I've crawled through this dark Mars facility before. In fact, I think I might have enjoyed Doom 3's slower pace better, even if I didn't think it was all that great of a game. The This game has multiplayer, and I realize it's been nearly 20 years since an id game has set standards in that arena, but having played both the alpha and the beta, I can say it works. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it works. With Doom, id did what it needed to survive, and with so many luminaries churned out of the studio in the past decade, I wonder if they can make a good step forward that isn't also a step back. It's the Tim Cook problem. While longtime game journalists are hailing this as some kind of masterwork, I genuinely can't fall in love with it. I can think of a lot of scenarios that a demonic invasion would be compatible with, like a neon downtown district under some Martian bubble, but I guess that's an adventure for another Doom game. It's time for something brief. I can safely say that Dodge Rolls Enter the Gungeon is my favorite game of the year so far. Vlambeer's Nuclear Throne, an indie that inspired Gungeon, was a punishing game, and I was hesitant to pick up yet another dual-stick roguelike with a 16-bit art style. I took the plunge, and Enter the Gungeon won me over anyway. With a variety of classes to play from the get-go, your job is to descend through the Gungeon's 5 levels to recover a gun that will allow you to rewrite your past. Your opponents are anthropomorphic ammunition of all shapes and sizes. The names and descriptions are littered with puns, and as you play, you build an impressive arsenal. Well, sort of. The game can be difficult, but not in a way that makes you feel like it's unfair, like how you can simply run out of ammo in Nuclear Throne and be completely screwed. Each time I died, I understood full well the mistakes that I'd made to get to that point. While your starting character will have different weapons and perks, all have access to the dodge roll, a move so important that the developers named the studio after it, although their one-color logo is incredibly confusing. Enemies spray bullets in various patterns, reminiscent of Japanese bullet hell games, requiring you to not only be quick on the sticks, but to memorize their tactics, especially when they work together. With effective use, the dodge roll allows you to skip through and around swarms of enemies and their discharge. The controls are very responsive, helped by an incredible suite of art and animations. Since you'll be playing with the controller exclusively, the auto-aim is both helpful and a drawback. While it helps against off-screen foes, its quirky decision-making will tend to lock onto enemies near explosive barrels rather than the explosive barrels themselves. As a roguelike, each level is randomly generated, with more rooms and enemies appearing as you purchase upgrades and complete various goals. Every second or third room features a teleporter, so with a trigger pull, you can hop back and forth across each floor easily. Capping each level is a unique, randomized boss battle that grants you the credits you need to unlock more weapons. From flaming devil heads and unicorn horns to miniguns and t-shirt cannons, you'll usually find something new and incredibly interesting almost every single time that you play. You'll develop favorite drops and learn where they're best used, but not usually on the first go-around. You'll also be taunted to unlock each chest you see, but you're better off saving your limited number of keys for the true behemoths that dole out better drops. Enter the Gungeon feels like a pretty immense game. The biggest reason to love this game is that you can start rolling and blasting inside of 10 seconds from launch. Each round lasts about 15 to 25 minutes, and you'll find it's absolutely perfect for breaks or as a palate cleanser. Everything loads fast and menus are snappy and creative. The game maintains a very clean user experience throughout, but I wish it featured a little more on screen, like an info box that told you what an item did before you dropped precious currency for it. Gungeon isn't perfect. I've put over 40 hours into its hauls, but I don't feel like I've made much progress. Sure, I've unlocked a bunch of cool guns, but I've also unlocked a bunch of crappy ones too. Aside from knowing my enemies better than when I started, I don't feel like I really have a leg up now versus when I started playing, even as I've been filling the Gungeon's topside mall with rescued characters and vendors. Expensive items show up in shops on the first level, and it's weird not to be making more money or getting more keys at this point. There also doesn't seem to be much of a reward for clearing rooms without taking damage, like extra money. That would help. There are many times when I knew how long my run was going to last based on RNG. It's odd to arrive at a boss battle with only your stock gun when there are so many cool weapons in the game. It would be amazing to pick one of the game's many whacking guns as a starter weapon. Even if I've never beat Enter the Gungeon, I still want to load it up and try again just about every single day. I've never even been to the Gungeon's 5th level, but I feel okay about that. Fast, funny, colorful, and most importantly, fun as hell, I simply can't recommend Enter the Gungeon enough. It's time for something brief. If you've ever had a passion to work on the chip design team at Intel or Nvidia, then Factorio is the perfect game for you. Let's back up a step. If you're anything like me, you love Minecraft, but wish there was far more to it. Once you get your fundamentals out of the way, like shelter and food, everything else is decorum. It doesn't matter how beautiful that thing is you just built, the game offers no reward for it. Not only do you wish for more functional structures, you also wish there was a way to automate mineral extraction without a bunch of crazy game modifications. Strategy games that allow you to gather resources, to build more advanced tools, to build even more complex devices are nothing new, but Factorio scratches that precise itch, and for still being in early access, it works surprisingly well. You, Factorio's astronaut protagonist, have been shipwrecked on an alien rock and need to build a rocket ship to get home. Naturally, you don't have a pair of intact boosters and a hull lying around to duct tape together and escape to orbit. You have to start with sand and eventually make microscopes, so to speak. Your starting equipment and miners rely on coal for fuel, so you'll need to have a supply available. Don't be surprised if you're extracting some of these early minerals by hand, just like Minecraft. Your electrical network will replace those old coal-powered miners, but now you'll need to convey a steady supply of coal to your steam machines to keep everything running. Your progression is marked by research. You can spend endless hours optimizing supply lines and eliminating bottlenecks, but all that clever planning goes out the window when some new widget calls for you to split your supply lines to feed another assembler to build the new thing to build the other new thing to manufacture the different colored research goo you need to build the next widget. Factorio is a game that rewards you for starting over to learn the ropes and implement better designs that don't involve a mile-long backlog of copper ore that isn't going anywhere. Ideally, your factory should take up as much space as possible to make future modifications as easy to implement as possible. Despite having large swaths of it, optimal real estate management is required. You'll run underground belts, handle strange new materials with different processing techniques, and so on. On the flip side, it's also easy to tighten your design so much that you can't place important structures, like the power poles you need to keep your second-tier equipment going at all. Unlike me, you may even get into the railroad nonsense that allows you to move large quantities of resources or widgets from one side of the factory to the other. The disadvantage of a large factory, however, is that the terrestrial life is hostile, and by default, will periodically chomp away at your base, so you'll need to invest in a defense infrastructure as well. You carry upgradable weaponry, but you can't hold off the bug-like swarms on your own. Thankfully, you can turn them off. It's easy to get lost with the game's lack of documentation. Factorio offers recipe cards for new technologies, but if you've ever had to whip out a Google search to remember how to make a bed in Minecraft, you may as well have a Factorio research open at all times. In fact, the only helping hand you'll get beyond the tutorial is the quick tips box that appears when you load a game. Ideally, you'll play Factorio so much that as each new tier of technology comes in, you'll have some mathematically ideal design already in mind that doesn't require scrapping half your dominion. But you won't, not for a while. The game can also be obtuse about why smelters aren't smelting, or other things aren't working, and you'll absolutely need a soft surface to bang your head against trying to figure out why. Would it be cool if the game had tutorials on how railways or petroleum production work so I didn't have to watch half a dozen YouTube videos? It sure would. While it has a learning curve and could use some polish, Factorio is theoretically far more valuable to students than Minecraft. It not only teaches the cause and effect relationships of automated assembly, it requires critical thinking to produce fundamentally sound designs, without which building the crazy advanced stuff would be difficult, if not impossible. I've put over 20 hours into this game, and even if I'm only about a third of the way up the tech ladder, I honestly can't wait to grab another blank slate and refine my designs. It's time for something brief. Firewatch is a first-person adventure from the industry veterans bunkered at Campo Santo. The game joins a growing number of what are derisively being called walking simulators by godless Philistines who don't see games like this, Gone Home, or Dear Esther as hyper-immersive adventure games, but as first-person shooters without guns. It's exceptionally lazy criticism when you consider classic adventure games have always involved marching across large expanses. So anyway, in Firewatch you play Henry, a man who escapes to the wilderness for the summer. Set in 1989, you may be Wyoming's last, Firewatcher of the decade. Your snarky and always enjoyable supervisor Delilah is a walkie-talkie button press away, and through the game you build a comfortable relationship as you grow accustomed to the ups and downs of the job.
Yeah, well, I'd go with Widowmaker.
Come on, it's really not that bad.
It's a 50-foot cliff made of rocks that look like knives.
They just look like knives, okay? Plus, there's already a Widowmaker on the backside of Carter Mountain. It would be confusing.
I'm not going to spoil anything because it would ruin the game. I will say, however, that the game's opener, which establishes why you fled to such a lonely post perched high above the forested mass, is one of the best I've seen in a game before. It's a slug to the gut and I immediately felt for Henry. Firewatch's world is big, but not open. The map is essentially a series of thick tubes with rocky borders that prevent you from getting any big ideas. As a result, it gets irritating at times when you approach a small ledge you can't jump over, leading you to backtrack all the way back down the path until you find the fork in the trail. The painterly Wyoming wilderness becomes its own character in a way, brought to life by designer Ollie Moss. The game's inclusion of a disposable camera is really neat, especially since you can purchase physical prints of your virtual photos. It's like the future or something. It has to be a Unity thing, but there's genuinely no reason why this game should be running sluggish at 4K on my machine. I also encountered a weird bug that hitched the game's audio between lines of dialogue, but I couldn't find anyone else with this problem.
Hey, that go okay?
At its core, this game is a lengthy conversation between Henry and Delilah, and the game shines its brightest when you get to know each other better. You don't actually have to reveal to Delilah why you're out here, but I always felt the need to be honest and open with her anyway. Different responses will lead to slightly different conversations and callbacks later on. In a very specific way, their relationship reminded me of Charlie Kaufman's Anomalisa, which, before it was a fantastic animated film, it was actually written and performed as an audio play with actors sitting behind a desk on stage, accompanied by Foley artists and an orchestra. In that film, through Kaufman's incredible dialogue, we really got into the idiosyncrasies of its characters, much like we do with Henry and Delilah. Unfortunately, an ongoing intimate conversation doesn't make for a very exciting video game, so Firewatch resorts to escalation by introducing characters that are only seen in glimpses or spoken of via backstory. It doesn't quite work for me. Through the entire game, you only get within handshake distance of one other animated human, so when you're out prodding the forest for threats and mysterious figures and never encounter them, it makes the game's distractions feel hollow. You can promote false tension like this once or twice, but as a game-length Firewire to relieve and aggravate your relationship with Delilah, it falls flat. Issues with the plot aside, is Firewatch worth its $20 ask? I know it's a cop-out response, but it depends. By design, an adventure game's content is built almost exclusively around its narratives, so unless it's stuffed with difficult puzzles or dialogue trees to slow you down, you're gonna burn through games like this quick. Even with some occasionally tedious backtracking and lengthy climbing animations, Firewatch is no exception. I was watching the credits roll with a mere 3 hours on the play clock. The game does offer an audio commentary tour, which could potentially double your playtime, but your mileage will vary. In the end, Firewatch is a game I'm going to remember for a long time, when so many other shooters and strategy games have faded away, and that's probably why it needs a big leafy wilderness to walk through. Along with the game skips through time, the world adds weight to the how and why your relationship with Delilah ends up working. If Firewatch had been more confident about being the human experience it starts as, it might have been perfect. It's time for something brief. After feeling that Forza Horizon 2 was a step back in some ways from the first game, I was hesitant to dive headfirst into Playground's latest. In reality, I shouldn't have been. 4 years after its bright, sparkly debut, the open-world Horizon series sends you, an all-star racing champion, to Australia to build out the extravagant race/rave festival. As the fantasy boss, the big new wrinkle in the formula is that as you're racing around the world, winning races and pulling off death-defying jumps, you'll earn fans, on top of the usual funds and experience to buy cars and build up your skills respectively. Hitting various thresholds of fandom allows you to build and expand a quartet of festival sites that anchor this new world's expansive new desert, jungle, urban, and temperate biomes. This Australia is vivid, colorful, and wonderfully diverse, but getting used to the country's left side drive is, well, it's different. This is the best Horizon setting so far and a step up from the endless fields of Horizon 2. Being the biggest map in the series so far, it blows my mind that the developers are able to escalate the game's scale in the same 2 years with each successive game. Equally impressive is the game's attention to and selection of vehicles, including rare offerings from Australia's own Holden. The game's new biomes also take better advantage of the fact that the series has gone full field, as in you can literally drive off-road in any direction you want to. Because this Australia is broken up by elevation and vegetation far more often than Horizon 2, it's not as easy to draw a bead on a distant checkpoint and hammer the gas to zoom directly to your destination. If you can pull off a straight march across the countryside though, odds are you can rack up some insane points. Off-road races are a bit more acceptable this time around since the terrain works better to fence you in from flying off into the void, a huge problem in the second game. Thank God for the series' rewind capability that lets you undo a sad turn, or several, with a button press. Not to toot my own horn, but it seems the wizards at Playground Games took special note of my Horizon 2 review because so many of my issues with that game's campaign have been resolved or rolled back. Horizon 3 sheds the personalities of its predecessors in favor of making the festival the star of the proceedings, although there's still plenty of talking to be had by your garage staff. Gone is Horizon 2's road trip progression where you completed race after race after race in a seemingly never-ending sequence. As you expand each festival site, the game splatters a variety of new events across the map, recalling the first game, giving you the agency to explore the world first and pull off races and championships as you see fit. Giving the player the ability to control the growth of the Horizon Festival is a novel touch and something I really wanted in previous games. Even though your management decisions are extremely slight, the spectacle of the game still makes you feel like a boss. I'm not sure the series needs to crawl in the Madden direction where you manage hot dog prices, but it might be cool to see your fan count wax and wane depending on your performance in the field, or as rivals try to steal the stage. I don't know, could be cool. Make no mistake though, this is a Horizon game and some of these bones are starting to feel old. The experience grid is tweaked but familiar. Barn finds are still tough, as is the challenge of finding every last one of the game's 488 roads. The spectacular races against stunt opponents like jeeps dangling from helicopters or against a squad of speedboats still feel as superficial as ever. As small as it sounds, the photo mode's upload options are still notoriously spare. Seriously, you still can't directly upload photos to Facebook or Twitter? I mean, come on now. Horizon 3 is an incredibly fun and well-produced game with some fun tweaks to the series formula. Being the first of Microsoft's cross-play games, it works well on their console and my Windows 10 machine, giving me the stupendous ability to race on two machines 4 feet apart. This third game sits firmly between the genius of the original game and the missteps of the second, but it feels strained to work within the profitable framework of what a Horizon game should be. I hope Playground goes back to formula in some big ways for the next title with a world that's just as exciting as this one. It's time for something brief. Hailing from an era where LucasArts could do no wrong, Full Throttle was the shimmering crown jewel of their adventure game lineup. You have to remember that once upon a time, some 22 years ago, LucasArts was a haven of very creative game developers who had the leeway to experiment with a variety of non-Star Wars ideas when not making incredible games with the legendary label anyway. Writer, designer, and crazy man Tim Schafer wasn't expecting a big hit with their dystopic bike punk adventure, but Full Throttle broke the mold and the bank. Taking full advantage of the CD-ROM boom of the mid-90s, Full Throttle was cinematic to an extreme, with well-crafted 2D and 3D animations giving life to a murder adventure with a memorable cast and an extremely clever sense of humor. As a kid fascinated with flying cars and futuristic-looking choppers with crazy exhaust pipes, Full Throttle was extremely interesting when it released. In this game's strange American wasteland, biker gangs seem to be the most common unit of social order. After Malcolm Corley is bludgeoned to death by his jealous second-in-command, the gravelly-voiced and wedge-jawed Ben, head of the Polecats, is framed for the deed, and the burden of clearing him and the gang falls on you. It's been criticized for its breezy length since it was released, but when you consider how small the development team was, every aspect of its content feels economical, whether it's the cutscene to gameplay ratio, elaborately crafted set pieces, or incredible animations. The gameplay consists of puzzles, dialogue, and action. The puzzles were clever, and the game ditched the verb-based interface of its LucasArts predecessors by integrating a context-sensitive interface that freed up screen estate to present a bigger, more cinematic universe. The simple ability to hop on your bike and travel between destinations made the game feel huge, despite the game's lack of content. The dialogue, dripping with wit, said just enough while leaving anything about the how and why this world came to be to mystery. Full Throttle's action portions, however, weren't great back then or now. The game's lengthy Mine Road sequence, originally powered by Rebel Assault's limited FMV tech, is frustratingly tedious while requiring a maddening level of precise timing. It would be so easy for Double Fine, Tim Schafer's now longtime game studio, to slap a DOSBox wrapper around the original game, throw it on GOG, and call it a day. But this game has been retouched in every aspect, similar to the remastering of Schafer's other games, Day of the Tentacle and Grim Fandango. Art has been cleaned up and rebuilt for this new high-definition 16:9 future, and the game's dialogue and music, once rendered crunchy by extreme compression, has been rescanned or recomposed. With the press of a button, you can toggle between both versions for reasons nostalgic and otherwise, and it may be my favorite part of this game. While the remastered art works 9 times out of 10, it sometimes suffers by being a little too faithful to the original game. In one way, the awkward timing of various sequences, which came across as a mix of tech and budget issues way back when, are recreated perfectly, rendering them awkward again for a new age. Remastered character art, especially in the new menus, looks like it was quickly drawn over in Flash, and it looks cheap. because it was redrawn in Flash. Some of the new animations and backgrounds simply don't look great either, as if the artists were retracing the original work rather than understanding how the characters moved or how the backgrounds were supposed to look in the first place. Backgrounds also look smudgy and hastily produced in spots. On the other hand, hearing the cleaner dialogue is a treat, and being able to really hear Mark Hamill and Adrian Ripberger's performance is its own unexpected surprise. Like so many of these adventure game re-releases that finally work on modern game machines, Full Throttle feels like a relic. It's got a fresh coat of paint and different control schemes for its original PC home or on Sony's platforms, but I wonder who the game is for, except for us nostalgic old coots. Considering how forgiving you have to be to handle some of the game's old mechanics, or how LucasArts fumbled with a sequel for years before the studio closed, it's unfortunate this may be the last comprehensive note we receive from this one-of-a-kind universe that simply didn't experience enough life the first time around. Then again, considering how poorly nostalgia converts to quality in this day and age, it might be for the best that Ben and the Polecats ride off into the sunset forever. It's time for something brief as we go back in time to examine the birth and life of what may be the best twin-stick shooter franchise ever, Geometry Wars. Given form by bizarre creation Stephen Cakebread, one of a handful of technical staff who was given largely free rein to develop demos at the British developer, Geometry Wars debuted in the best racing game of all time, Project Gotham Racing 2. While the team was busy polishing PGR2 ahead of its holiday 2003 release, Cakebread built a tiny Space Wars-esque shooter and tucked it into an arcade cabinet you could only access if you walked around your virtual garage. The walk-around virtual garage was also a Cakebread invention. In Geometry Wars, you pushed your claw-shaped ship across an arena, firing at various multicolored shapes that would otherwise do you in. It was primitive-looking, insanely difficult, but also incredibly fun. Forget the driving game, let's zap some annoying green diamonds. Bizarre and Microsoft saw the huge potential of a standalone version for the debut of the Xbox 360 and Xbox Live Arcade, a marketplace for smaller bite-sized games that could be delivered digitally through the console. While Cakebread was prodding for a free release, Geometry Wars Retro Evolved was a smash hit when it launched for $5 alongside the Xbox 360 in late 2005. Essentially a polished version of the original game, with a larger play area that took advantage of the console's ability to push polygons and high-definition graphics, the game wasn't as tough to play, which made it easier to enjoy. While the gameplay didn't change much from the original, Retro Evolved saved its quirkiest challenge for its pacifism achievement, which required the player to survive 60 seconds without firing a shot at the growing gallery of geometric bad guys. A huge chunk of the game's fun came from its leaderboards, which challenged you to try just one more time to beat your friend's score. Considering Cakebread was Retro Evolved's biggest budget item and it wound up on so many Xbox 360s, as well as the PC later on, it made sense that Bizarre would want to make a second game. Debuting in 2008 after the developer was purchased by Activision, Cakebread went all out on features, game modes, and trippy, colorful particle effects. The biggest addition was Geomes, which were gold diamonds left behind by vanquished opponents that built your score multiplier. No longer could you simply sprint around in a circle around the map spraying triangular ammunition. You need to run back over the grave sites of your vanquished foes to build your score. Geomes fundamentally changed the game and made leaderboard competitions even more intense. Despite all the crazy additions, like the sequence mode designed to teach you how to combat different enemies, my favorite mode wound up being pacifism. Stripped of your guns, you can only inflict damage short range by passing through exploding gates, making the mode a mad scramble that requires the tightest control of your ship between encroaching swarms. While it seemed blasphemous when Activision brought Geometry Wars to the Wii and the DS when the series had been an Xbox exclusive for its entire life to that point, Bizarre Creations and Stephen Cakebread were platform-agnostic developers. While other teams handled those versions, Cakebread did single-handedly port the game to iPhone in a day. He also told me that Bizarre never really got behind making these smaller, more profitable games, and Bizarre continued to focus on big-budget $60 games that didn't fare well commercially. Activision closed Bizarre in 2011, but resurrected the series with Geometry Wars 3 Evolved under the similarly reborn Sierra branding. It's a solid, flashy game that includes all of the old and a whole lot of new, but the game's biggest fault, something that several fans leveled at Geometry Wars 2, is feature creep. Developer Lucid Games included more game modes than you can imagine, 3D playfields that are interesting to play on until they obstruct your view, progression ladders, upgradable helper bots to help you demolish enemies or gather geomes, and boss battles. It's a bit much. The game is also so in love with its new aesthetic that restarting, which is something you'll be doing often, requires a lengthy level build animation, something that only took a few split-second button presses in older games. While Retro Evolved and the third game are available on more platforms today, in my mind Geometry Wars 2 is the pinnacle of the franchise. Yeah, it has 2 or 3 more modes than it needs, but it's a brutally efficient and gorgeous game that improves on Retro Evolved in every way. If you still have an Xbox 360 hanging around, then this is the edition to own. It's time for something brief. Halcyon 6 is the most exciting game that's come across my Steam account in a while. It's the future, in space, and the wild-eyed Cruel are materializing everywhere, devastating the new Terran Federation. As the Federation's new leader, your only hope of survival is Halcyon 6, an ancient alien superstructure that you'll use to rebuild your fleet, research new technologies, and deal with nearby alien races, friendly and otherwise. Halcyon 6 Starbase Commander is essentially space XCOM. The vast majority of the game takes place in one of three screens: the star map where you'll deploy fleets and manage time, the Starbase Manager where you explore and build out your starbase, and the combat panel where you'll face off against the cruel, rogue alien robots, or overzealous merchants. From the star map, you'll work hard to gather the game's 4 resources and intercept alien threats. Nearby races will present diplomatic quests, but for the most part, you're uncovering resource mines within the once glorious Federation and defending them from aliens. Maintaining supply lines is essential to your efforts, and you'll be thankful to develop drones that retrieve your resources automatically rather than having to cart your fleet between systems to gather them by hand. Everything you do hinges on building and maintaining a staff, which becomes more difficult and expensive as your roster grows. Need to upgrade this mine? You'll need an officer to do that. Need a new officer? You're gonna need an officer. Losing a high-level staff member or spaceship is crippling, since you'll never maintain a large quantity of either. As your officers rank up, you can augment them with space and ground-based combat abilities, but since you'll rarely ever fight phaser to phaser, it's easy to let those abilities slide. Combat is essentially a reskinned JRPG battle mode. You'll line up with up to 3 vessels or personnel and dole out melee attacks, buffs, heals, special attacks, and more, turn by turn. Here's a pro tip. Learn to use the keyboard and these matches will go much faster. Trust me, I'll explain why in a second. The game borrows a lot aesthetically and thematically from Star Trek, and it was hard not to imagine this as the much bigger brother of 2013 Star Command, another kick-started space management indie game. Halcyon 6 has a very charming look and a fun sense of humor, and while a lot of it feels borrowed, it's borrowed very well. One of the few but big points where the game falters is in its soggy mid-game. After a whirlwind hand-holding tutorial, Halcyon 6 presents a myriad of interesting missions featuring the game's other races one after the other. For the first few hours, the game feels somewhat curated as I quickly wiped out the nearby alien pirate threat, if only to quickly acquire their resources. But all these fun little alien missions and diplomatic meetings disappear for the most part, and the game becomes a drag. Now you're on watch indefinitely, dispatching cruel patrols and sewing up their spawning portals. With so few officers, abilities, and ships on your end to mix things up, even the combat becomes a chore when you're having to destroy 5 or 6 patrols in a row, return to base to repair, then rush back out to do the same thing when they respawn a few days later. Memories of invisible ink rang through my head as I reached the end of my first doomed campaign. Mistakes in either game aren't readily apparent, so you won't know you've really screwed up until way down the line. If you can complete Halcyon 6 in your first go, then congratulations, you're a superhuman. While I know that restarting an XCOM campaign was a common tactic, whether in the original or its remake, the game was still very careful not to overwhelm you. I was having a super awesome blast with Halcyon 6 until the Cruel began spawning from 2 portals and 2 spire megastructures. I felt that the difficulty had hockey sticked after I built a line of tier 2 ships. Until that point, I'd been rolling the competition pretty easily with a single fleet. Now that the Cruel could overwhelm my entire infrastructure in one wave, I noped right out of the campaign. I realized that if I'd been more diligent about building up my fleets and supply lines and researching new technology, I would have been fine, but the idea of shrugging off a 7-hour campaign and starting over isn't a very exciting one. One day I'll return to Halcyon 6 and save the galaxy. It just won't be today. It's time for something brief as we examine yet another unbeaten roguelike, Clay's cleverly named Invisible Ink. If I only had one word to describe it, hardcore would fit the bill precisely. Falling squarely in the overlap between a full turn-based strategy game like XCOM and an action roguelike like Enter the Gungeon, your antics here revolve around building a team of crack cyberpunk agents and infiltrating megacorporations. You see, Invisible Ink's hidden headquarters isn't smashed open, and you, along with a handful of personnel, are all that remains. You now have 72 hours to get Incognita, your decaying AI companion, plugged in before she disappears, and your spy agency's efforts go down the drain entirely. In your quest, you'll trot the globe, accepting missions to gather funds, personnel, weapons, and intelligence, paying careful attention to your transit times. Individually, the game's bright, polygonal characters and overloaded backgrounds that were popular in the early aughts might not have worked, but together, they give the game a quirky and fun look. The levels obscure details sometimes, like that last unsecured door you're desperately searching for, but it stays out of its own way for the most part. Mechanically, Invisible, Inc. is a masterclass in brutally efficient design. At any point you have very few resources and plenty of choices to make with equally viable options. To know you screwed up immediately would be too easy. Many of your bad decisions won't be felt until you're a few turns, or even a few missions, far too late to fix them. If you spend 12 hours flying out to BFE to pick up a captured agent, will you have enough money to arm them, or will you simply be tugging them along each mission as a liability? If I knock out this guard, do I spend 2 or 3 turns dumping him in an adjacent room? Or do I sprint toward the next objective, hoping he doesn't trip up my party later on? Do I use my precious incognito points to keep cameras from revealing my agents? Or do I steal from another corporate safe? Thankfully, since the missions are turn-based, you have all the time in the world to weigh your options. Since the game keeps very close tabs on your save state, in part to avoid reload abuse, it grants you a rewind option to skip back a turn and, potentially, rewrite a bad move. Unlike a large strategy game like XCOM, you can't simply throw money at replacing agents or equipment like they're idling in bulk at the local warehouse. When an agent dies in the field, they're gone forever. The game is stacked against you from the beginning, and even as it seems like you're making progress, it only becomes more difficult. Invisible, Inc. is all about escalation. Not only do you have a mere 72 hours to plug Incognita back into a power source, the threat level will increase within each mission as your corporate opponents become aware of your ingress, so you can't linger. Terminals, cameras, and drones will require more hacking points to disable as time progresses, and guards will spawn to hinder your progress. The game will introduce malware demons that guard critical targets, so you roll the dice on a variety of digital penalties, like losing your hacking access entirely for a few turns. The game has guns, and while kills are guaranteed, you'll rarely get more than a single use, so they need to be used sparingly. There's a reason why I never got too far into this game. It's designed to fail you. But Nick, that's what a roguelike does. You fail to gain the personal experience and in-game items you need to do better in the next round. Sure, but games like Splunky, Enter the Gungeon, and Teleglitch are designed to fail you so fast, you keep coming back. It can be an hour or two into a game of Invisible, Inc. before you realize you need to start over and take better advantage of the early levels. Even if you've got some experience, it only takes one wrong move in the first mission before your agency is doomed. It's a big reason why I never fell in love with Pikmin. If I knew I wasn't progressing quickly enough to repair Captain Olimar's spacecraft, I was far more interested in putting the tiny disc back in its case than starting over. Invisible, Inc. requires an intense and thoughtful gaze at all times. You simply can't screw up at any point because your chances of recovery are dismal. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this design, but it only works in short bursts for me. It's well worth a look, and hey, maybe you'll get more out of it than I did, operator. It's time for something brief. While many of us remember George Miller's vibrant Mad Max sequel, Fury Road, it seems our collective gaze slid right off the just-in-time franchise video game. It doesn't take much time with Avalanche Studios' open-world action game to realize why. It's bleak, joyless, and most damningly, not very fun. As Wasteland Warrior and car enthusiast Mad Max, your turns are finished by the terrible overlord Scabrous Scrotus, who quickly winds up with a chainsaw on his forehead. Still, your car is destroyed, and you need all the help you can get from your deranged but well-meaning mechanic Chumbucket, who winds up being the game's only bright spot.
Look, your black on black is toast, it's scrap, it's gone. She'll never be whole again.
Your new chummy pal's got a new ride for you, the Magnum Opus. But you have to help him build it by collecting scrap and advancing the story by demolishing Scrotus's remaining influence on the land. Crafted by the masters who brought us the colorful, joyful, and insanely fun Just Cause 2, Mad Max leaves a sour first impression. Max, the cars he drives, and the third-person camera all feel unresponsive as they lurch into action with each shift of your thumbs. It's something you get used to, but it never feels great. Playing like an inverted version of the Just Cause games, the usefulness of Rico's guns is swapped out for a brawler-based combat system. And since you don't have a parachute and hook to zip across the wasteland, you'll be driving a lot, which makes sense. Mad Max is the open-world genre distilled to its highest Scoville rating. It's a good thing the Magnum Opus has functioning brakes because the wasteland is populated with a bandit camp to raid, or a scarecrow to knock down, or an oil well to detonate every 500 feet or so. It feels oddly populated for such a brutal landscape. Of course, each province would have some tower equivalent, here in the form of a hot air balloon to scope out nearby activities. It's a slightly interesting twist on the same old because you literally scope out nearby activities. Keeping with the survivalist theme, you'll need to keep a supply of water and fuel handy for the sake of you and your car, but the mechanic is deflated by the fact that both are available in plentiful supply. In the car, you'll find plenty of random war boys to knock over. You can pop into slow-mo to shotgun them, but it's far more fun to pick them out with your harpoon, a handy tool you'll put to good use dismantling structures too. On foot, Max is a mixed bag. The The brawling system is borrowed from other better games, but it's still solid here. The controls are designed to be lockstep with the cars, so running with the right trigger and having to hold down a shoulder button to draw guns takes some getting used to. Max has meek jumping abilities and no edge detection to speak of, meaning that the game's platforming sucks. Technically the game looks good, but the wasteland rarely amounts to much beyond its sandy deserts and flaming spires in the distance. When the game isn't trying to twist your stomach with rancid dog food or pools full of maggots, there's not much else going on visually. There's little of the hyperkinetic magic or color of Fury Road, it's just sand. Progression is also so dull that I could only stand playing it for extended periods of time if I had a podcast running to keep my brain busy. The magnum opus is loaded with far too many upgrade options alongside separate templates to put a different face on your car. Max has not one but two ability trees to upgrade, and it's also incredibly overwhelming. You can grind out all the camps you want to gather the scrap you need to purchase these upgrades, but many of them are locked behind missions that I couldn't care less about, an Avalanche hallmark from Just Cause 2. Mad Max is a game that not only sheds the movie's flavor to play up the dull and macabre, but also the enjoyable gameplay of Avalanche's other games. After the first few hours, I dreaded even having to open the game because the game simply isn't that fun. A lot of effort went into crafting this game and its world, but even at a $10 sale price, I felt ripped off, considering there's obviously dozens of hours of gameplay hiding inside this game's odious shell. While Avalanche's American studio brought us the serviceable Just Cause 2 sequel we all thought we wanted, these guys made a dull drag of a Mad Max game that, well, no one wanted. It's time for something brief, and while I wish I had more than 800 words for Master of Orion, being in early access means that's all it gets for now. If the Conquer the Galaxy subgenre of 4X strategy games were a concert tour, Master of Orion would be the headlining act. While these games are a dime a dozen now, and some even bring an interesting idea here and there, most are weighted down by poor showmanship or a lack of interesting mechanics, something Orion had in spades. Your favorite game in the series depends on which one you played first, whether it was the bright and flashy but simple first game, or the bland as graphite but more sophisticated second game. No one played the third game, but let me leave a note about that for later. It turns out that the CEO of free-to-play Monster Wargaming has a soft spot for the Orion series, so he bought the rights and had a team split between Texas and Argentina working on a reboot, making it the first Orion game in 13 years. If you've never played Master of Orion before, and you should, Civilization in Space is a pretty apt summary. You start with a single colony, and through exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extermination, you build an empire to span the galaxy. You research technologies to build bigger and better ships to intimidate and conquer your neighbors, you send spies into the ether to gather secrets or cause unrest, and you call on your allies when a mutual enemy attacks. Mechanically, the game is essentially the second game, with the cheery aesthetic of the first. This means you can micromanage the motives and production lines of your empire, while the game's spirit is brought to life by incredible remixes from the original soundtrack and quirky characters like the Galactic News Network anchors who pop up periodically to update you on your status in the galaxy and other strange happenings. While the early game has you expanding into unoccupied space, the mid-game feels undercooked. Once borders begin to form, you spend a lot of time watching your colonies build infrastructure and, hopefully, amass a fleet to defend against the random declaration of war. Victory can take a variety of forms. Sure, you can wipe out every other race in the galaxy, but that takes ages, and the game's really interested in getting you past the finish line before the industry standard 500 turns. You can win the majority of votes in the Orion Council, you can purchase the majority of shares on the Interstellar Stock Exchange, which is a bit shaky for a victory condition so far. You can simply be the best scoring ruler in the galaxy, on and on. Even if you become the titular Master of Orion, the game will let you continue playing, so if you're in the middle of a genocidal tear when the bell rang, hey, the game's not gonna stop you. Okay, so that note from earlier. The third Master of Orion game seems to destroy everything it touches, because its one major contribution to this reboot is my least favorite: lanes. In older Orion games, you could send ships in any direction so long as you had the fuel technology to get there. While you would occasionally encounter wormholes that folded portions of the galaxy, the field approach meant you really had to strategize how you built your own supply lines and defensive fronts. With the new Orion's lanes approach, all systems are tied together through pre-generated routes that dictate where and how confrontations will happen. This means your home system is usually safe from arbitrary external access, while allowing you to build defensive outposts and structures. While it simplifies your choices, it also eliminates a chunk of them too. You're not going to spend nearly as much time formulating battle plans when your attacks can only be funneled through a handful of lanes into enemy space. It really sucks if you get stuck at the end of a galactic spiral like these Darlocks were. As a lifelong fan of the series, this reboot feels like coming home. Differentiating from newcomers like Stellaris, Wargaming didn't feel like they needed to toss every single mechanic they could think of into this game. Instead, they took what were two solid games and averaged out their highlights to make a title that's not only the most approachable in the genre so far, but a reboot that's far more interested in being a fun time. I didn't get to talk about the real-time space combat or the incredible voice cast.
It was folly to trust you in the first place.
But I can say that unless they do something dramatically foul in the next few months, Wargaming's take on this strategy classic is a winner. It's time for something brief. While a million think pieces have tried to explain what No Man's Sky is, let me try another way. Iridium is one of the many minerals you need to gather on this game's intergalactic quest. It takes the form of massive pillars on the game's planets. Chopping the obelisk down with your mining laser, you realize you're merely erasing its contents from space. Even with nothing to support it, the top half of the pillar won't fall. As you erase more, it leaves little erroneous-looking shards that also appear throughout the terrain of the game's 18 quintillion worlds. You hop from planet to station, observation tower to black hole, and you erase things to never see them again, and nothing you do matters. No, this game wasn't what I was expecting. In so many ways, this feels like my experience playing Fable years ago. There are a lot of very interesting half ideas here. The game's far too early reveal and Sony's aggressive marketing mix disastrously. You'll never find an ecosystem like this. You can attack freighters, but you're really just erasing a ship from the universe. There are several factions, but they all feel the same. There are many planets, but they all have the same sparse landscapes. There are lots of technologies to acquire, but they practically are the same. No Man's Sky is about the journey, not the destination. It may as well be called the Zen of interstellar travel. Starting out with a rapidly overheating mining laser and a scanning tool, you scrounge resources to repair your crashed ship. What do you ultimately do in this game? It's up to you. But the game's dreadful inventory management spoils the game's zen. Between your suit, ship, and multi-tool, you get a handful of slots to either handle minerals or install upgrades. Inventory management is a pain in other games, sure, but they don't feel like you're playing 2048 just to get something done. If your equipment slots are filled up, you can't even see what upgrades you can craft until you dismantle one of them. You can't even stack similar items. It's a terrible system. The game is a knee-deep swimming pool the size of Delaware. Hop to a new system and you'll find some planets and a space station. Gather enough fuel from the surface to hop to the next system and you'll find, well, more planets and another space station. Hop through a black hole and you'll get, well, you know. Abandoned buildings, iridium pillars, mushrooms, cave systems, over and over. You're also very alone out here. You rarely encounter more than one NPC in the same facility. You can learn each of the race's languages, but your protagonist manages to figure it out in the same panel anyway. No Man's Sky is no technical marvel graphically, but artistically it soars at times. In fact, sometimes the game's gears work together and generate just enough goodwill to keep going. Other times you're hopping mindlessly across an alien landscape searching for more plutonium to get your ship off the ground so you can stop hopping mindlessly across alien landscapes. The game offers you a guided tour to the center of the galaxy, or you can just off-road it and find your own way. But why would you ever off-road in this game? Why would you ever blindly hop from system to system in this game's clunky star map just for funsies? Why would you waste your time renaming planets? The answer is simple. It's because it's there. It draws from the same primal desire for exploration and wonder that makes you travel a bit further and dig a little bit deeper in a game like Minecraft. If you need an arrow pointing you to the next 20 seconds of fun, then this game won't be for you. Inventory issues aside, the game's worst offense is its disgusting PC launch. I did it all. Quick fixes, borderless windows, frame rate tweaks, driver updates, but even with stable frame rates, the game leaks like a Swiss boat. This happens every other time I hop into my ship, rendering the game unplayable until I hop out again. This version is awful. How could they have possibly shipped this game in this state with a clear conscience? I want to give this game another try when they make the PC version space-worthy, but even with the show-stopping bugs out of the picture, the mechanics alternate between hot and cold quick. It's stupid to expect Star Citizen-esque grandeur from a 12-person team, but I wonder if Hello Games can take this huge fabric they've sewn together, put some poles underneath it, and make it into a decent tent. I would still absolutely wait before plunking down a full $60 for this circus. It's time for something brief. I would expect nothing less than greatness from a Firaxis alumni, and Offworld Trading Company delivers. Soren Johnson, designer of Civilization 4, brings us a real-time strategy game that's, well, a little hard to explain. I'd watched some Let's Plays, but it wasn't until I booked through the game's thorough tutorial that this Martian economy simulator started to make sense. Let's take a more conventional real-time strategy game like StarCraft. Now, let's strip out all the combat and military units, and instead of gathering 2 resources like Vespene and minerals, you're actually acquiring the first are harvested from Mars itself, like water, power, and silicon. The second 7 resources, like glass and chemicals, are composites of the first. Instead of a unit cap, you have a limited number of claims to build new structures. If you need more claims, you'll need to upgrade your headquarters or score one in a random auction. Each of the game's 4 factions has a different economic advantage. The robots don't need to eat or drink, so they can sell all their food and water at nearly 100% profit. Scavengers can erect buildings with cheap carbon instead of having to refine steel. On and on. Each of the game's resources can be bought and sold. If you sell resources, you'll drive prices down. If you buy them, you'll drive their price up. It seems like a lot to think about, but it's really simple supply and demand. Winning the game requires feeling out and taking advantage of market conditions. Offworld Trading Company is all about building sturdy economic engines, which are done match by match through 4 non-discrete stages. In the pre-game, you'll scout out a good landing zone on the Martian surface. Unlike a more conventional game, your resources aren't all going to be conveniently clustered in one spot. Based on your faction, you'll need to weigh which minerals are going to be more advantageous to acquire early on, bearing in mind that you'll be flying them back to your HQ manually without teleportation research. For example, if your iron mine is on the far side of the map, good luck making any steel on a timely basis. If you plant your HQ early, you'll get access to prime real estate, but you'll literally pay for being a first mover. On the flip side, time lost is money lost anyway. If you choose a bad spot in this stretch, you may as well give up. In the opener, you'll focus on gathering the first set of resources with your handful of claims. This means mining minerals and establishing a power source, whether by solar, wind, or geothermal means. If you can't reliably make money in this critical stretch, you may as well give up. In the mid-game, you'll have to hone your mining operations and focus on the second 7 resources. Take that carbon and silicon and start making high-margin electronics and glass, which are vital for late-stage HQ upgrades. This is also the point where it makes sense to disrupt other players with black market tools. Since you don't have a standing military, your offensive capabilities are more like temporary debuffs to slow down other players. You can still blow up a structure here and there, but this is really a game about managing your economic ascent and tamping down the others. If you still can't reliably make money in this stretch, you may as well give up. The end game is all about sell, sell, sell. Now that you have a way of producing 3, 4, or more profitable resources in excess, you have to get rid of them. So what do you buy? Well, you may be purchasing modules to help a colony expand, but you might also be buying out your competition while defending your own shares. Even if you're reliably making money by this point, you can lose by not selling quick enough or by not using every last claim you hold responsibly. There's plenty I didn't get into here, like debt, your stock price, the campaign mode, research, being able to send resources off planet for buku bucks, or using the black market to defend critical money-making structures. The learning curve is a steep walk, and while the tutorials help, it can be disorienting to lose a string of matches after the game lets go of your hand. Unlike StarCraft, you won't need to make 1,000 decisions a minute, but the decisions you do make will be far more important and require a full scope of the action. If you're looking for something slightly crazy, highly rewarding, and don't mind a little training, Offworld Trading Company is a must-own. It's time for something brief. If a gaggle of teenagers encountering supernatural weirdness sounds enticing, then Oxenfree is the adventure game for you. Here, you play the teal-haired Alex on your way to an abandoned island for an overnight beach party with friends old and new. Just as it feels you're playing an interactive version of a TV teen drama, you wander into a cave, trigger a strange portal with your portable radio, and things start to get weird. The fabric of time isn't right on this island, and Alex needs to navigate through the island's various temporal loops and tears to reverse an incredible amount of damage. Oxenfree plays like a traditional adventure game with minimal controls. The keyboard moves you around the game's 2.5D-ish environments with corners that are ripe for getting stuck on, but you'll need to keep your other hand free to mouse through the game's speech bubble dialogue system, which I'll talk about in a second. You have no inventory except the knowledge of events that transpire before you, but you do utilize that portable radio to solve the game's puzzles, which, like The Witness, come in a single format that's tweaked over the course of the game. It's an interesting twist, having to fine and tune into a specific frequency to cause stuff to happen, but the radio's hints can get lost in the game's audio mix, and considering the variety of noise that exists across the game's radio spectrum, it can be difficult to draw a beat on the specific frequency you need to progress. So let's talk about that dialogue system, which is mechanically Oxenfree's highlight. In traditional adventure games, conversations go back and forth, turn by turn. Someone will say something to you, and you'll respond to them with a myriad of responses that are used to provide background information or clue you in on puzzles and so on. Oxenfree's dialogue system, however, occurs in real time, and is designed to mimic the flow of real conversations. As others speak, dialogue options will appear above Alex and fade out as they become irrelevant or the conversation is about to pivot. These choices will allow you to build or diminish relationships with the other characters over the course of the game, and it's a really interesting system that, well, mostly works. If you've ever been on journalist beat interviewing people, you know that a prime skill to master is the ability to not only process what your guest is saying, but to formulate the next question based on their response as they're giving it. It's an interesting bit of multitasking that takes a little getting used to, so using it in a game is an interesting proposition. Conversations in Oxenfree, regardless of the subject, sound familiar and natural, but having to ponder dialogue choices before they fade away can be a hassle, especially since you can't conjure the topic again later like you would in a normal conversation or in a traditional adventure game. While walking around, you need to be ready to understand and click on dialogue choices, or the game will simply move the conversation forward without you. I'm tempted to New Game Plus this thing and abstain from talking as much as possible just to see what ultimately happens. Oxenfree's presentation is pretty incredible. The music and sound design are phenomenal, from the dainties you hear around the haunted levels, to the clever use of vintage audio clips to build the tone, to the phantom radio spectrum. The music works supremely well to produce a sense of menace. The voice acting works, but the voice direction rarely prods any sense of danger like it does in the stellar work of fellow adventure game Firewatch, and this deflates the supernatural drama. The only visual miss may be the flat-looking character models marching on top of the game's wonderful painterly backgrounds. Without spoiling anything, the game's weakest point may be its villain. The game works super well to produce a sense of dread, but this is a story about Alex and a relationship she has with her friends, set to incredible special effects and a hearty dab of melodrama, for better and worse. The supernatural villainy that ties this whole thing together winds up being a B story that never quite reaches its apex in the time we have with the game. Still, Oxenfree is a solid adventure game for anyone who enjoys the genre. It's well produced with an interesting premise, even if the story doesn't quite hit its potential. Plus, at a few short hours in length, it's even worthy of an extra playthrough just to see how you can mold a narrative, like a good choose-your-own-adventure book. It's time for something brief. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is really damn fun. Based on the Battle Royale Arma 3 game mode crafted by the titular mod maker with no small help from the Hunger Games, PUBG sends 100 players to an Eastern European themed archipelago to duke it out until one player remains. Your results may vary, but my adventures often found me dead, but back again and again. To become a PUBG champion, you need to understand the game's 3 stages. The first, land. You start with the clothes on your back, a parachute, and a map. Your match's sentry is loaded in a big plane, and with the press of a button, it's time to hop out, land, and scour the abandoned countryside for loot, while praying you don't get nailed by a faster player. You'll cobble together a makeshift inventory of armor and weaponry, including shirts, pants, a variety of guns and helpful mods, as well as healing utensils, but only if you're lucky. The best equipped players won't stop at one villa or apartment complex. They'll need to keep moving, hopping on and on to gather as much of the best gear as possible. Second stage, move. The large map is a pleasant, authentic feeling landscape of rolling hills, small towns, and large open fields. It's also the tensest non-horror game I've ever played. There's simply nothing like fleeing a spray of random bullets, or desperately running toward another group of buildings to wind up with something better than a motorcycle helmet and a stun grenade. You'll also need to deal with the game's random air bombings. Since these matches could theoretically play out for hours or days as the final players seek each other out, the map creates a play zone that shrinks in waves as the match progresses. Staying outside the play zone, on the other side of a glowing blue barrier, will eventually kill you. The play zone is randomly drawn from match to match, and you'll need to be wary of where you land, lest you be left behind. Finding a car to get across this map is not the easiest task. In a huge way for those used to the auto-aim or gameplay assistance of the typical modern shooter, Battlegrounds feels like a throwback to the hoary days of Tom Clancy's original Ghost Recon games. Here you can hide in the world's thick vegetation and rolling hills, but get cut down by an unseen opponent just as easily. Since your job is to wind up as the last player on the map, you better pray to the RNG gods and act with a patient heart, or you'll end up dead over and over. Speaking of which, That final stage, kill. Winding up in the top 10 is an exercise in either extreme skill or patience, and lacking the former, I relied heavily on the latter. Getting around a map this big discreetly with only 99 other opponents isn't too hard if you stay away from the villages and open plains. Unlike other games, you'll quickly find that camping out is a valid survival strategy here. Seriously, find a structure in the play zone, keep all the doors closed to shake the opponent's notion that you've already plundered these buildings, or don't, then lie in wait for them to make the biggest mistake of their virtual lives. As the play zone constricts to a closure, you'll run into a variety of challenges that this game's desperate endgame offers. Hopefully you've scavenged enough ammo to handle your final opponents and didn't needlessly spray it at someone who wound up getting away anyway. Hopefully you don't stumble into the campsite of another lucky player who wound up there first. Most importantly, hopefully you're just faster on the trigger with a better gun than the other person. As of this edit, my best position is 9th, so a chicken dinner is still elusive. Put simply, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is a fantastic gimmick. While AAA shooters focus on providing a bunch of game modes that satisfy to varying degrees, PUBG focuses on executing its one big idea as well as possible, and it's a gamble that works. Being a successful game in early access is a huge liability as they build and improve the game. How much can you change or add without offending the throngs of millions who play or watch the game being played for countless hours daily? It's truly an innovator's dilemma for developer Bluehole, and aside from all the sales, I can't say I'm envious of what they have to do next. Even though this ride is still white hot, early, and still a little shady on the technical end, PUBG is a game you should definitely take the plunge on.
Alright, who wants an arrow dick? Anybody want an arrow dick?
Sure, man, hit me up.
Alright.
It's time for something brief. Red Faction Guerrilla is one of the most fun games I've ever played. My memories of sledgehammer rampages came flowing back to me after erasing pillars in last week's episode for No Man's Sky. I hadn't played the earlier Red Faction entries, so it was a surprise when, way back in 2009, I fell in love with this game. Instead of erasing terrain and digging tunnels like its predecessors, you knock down structures in a Martian society being oppressed by bald overlords from Earth. As a jacketed near-bald figure from Earth who isn't an overlord, you're the front man for a new Martian revolution, and you need to smash things by any means necessary. You'll even get to ride along with nativist rednecks who have no issues spouting terraphobic sermons. Many of your missions are playgrounds of valid approaches, whether you're breaking through buildings to rescue hostages with your sledgehammer, feeling out weak points in complex EDF structures and blowing them up, or simply driving through a fortification with a big truck. You even have an extremely limited ability to practice stealth maneuvers. Within the EDF's smoldering remains, you'll find the shimmering scrap that serves as the currency you need to build out your cache of weaponry. Tech-wise, the game feels like an inflection point. Havoc-based physics had been around for many years by the release of Guerrilla, but Volition's brain trust used it to build out dynamic destruction in a way we hadn't seen before. While the game challenges you to destroy structures in a creative, non-sledgehammer-based way, they could have just made a sledgehammer game and called it a day. Of course, being more intimate with your malice means you're often tripping over rubble, or, allowing buildings to collapse on top of you. There are limitations to the game's powers though. It's hilarious to see a building with most of its supports chopped out, still floating in the air as the game maths out its destruction to the sound of creaking fatigue. There's also a sparsity to the settlements that builds character in this Wild West version of Mars to keep the game from dying from calculations, but it feels slightly fake. A lot of these buildings are empty, unfurnished shells spread across the countryside, and you'll spend a lot of time driving between them. As you roll back the EDF advance, colonists will join you in the fight. Arriving in each district, there won't be much support, but you'll find plenty of help simply pops up once the hammer gets swinging. I've complained about the lack of penalties and harming innocent bystanders in other games, but Guerrilla hammers the point home that these people are your support mechanism. If you get sloppy, you demoralize them. At first, I thought the tight layout of the game's introductory area felt like a technical limitation. All of your earliest missions are always a turn or two away from your safe house. But with each subsequent zone, the game places you further and further from your objectives until you're having to traverse a desert to get anything done. Lesson learned, Volition, but did we really need to make the miles-long trek into town from our secluded base every single time we died, which was definitely more often than I would have liked? Volition's games, the Saints Row titles included, are fun, first and foremost, but they all seem to lack a few layers of polish. In particular, Guerrilla's Mars is very boring to look at. Even the game's fancy pants high-end residential area doesn't feel much different after blowing through the muted reds, browns, and grays of the rest of the world. The snow-capped and punishing finale is over well before you can think much about it. When you're not blowing stuff up, the game's admittedly a little bit less fun. I mentioned you'll be driving a lot and the model never feels quite right. Vehicle response always feels a split second behind the controller input. For all of your destructive powers, you'll still need some standard weaponry to mow down EDF troopers, who appear a bit too frequently and far too quickly for my tastes. Lacking an auto-aim in the Xbox 360 version or the PC version with a controller makes shooting a weird affair too. 7 years after I've beaten it, Guerrilla is still an enjoyable romp. What blows my mind is that after all this time, with all of the extra horsepower we have now to calculate insane physics, the closest thing to the dynamic freeform destruction Guerrilla achieved lies in the of Just Cause 3 and the urban corridors of the next Crackdown game, which is still another year away. As for when the Red Faction will rise again, well, only Nordic Games knows at this point. It's time for something brief. For this 20th episode of Nth Briefly, I'm stepping back in time to revisit an all-time classic, SimCity 2000, a game that, in sticking with the theme, I haven't played in 20 years. Operating without the game's manual in an era before YouTube tutorials, SimCity 2000 was a weird game as a kid. I'd paint its tan landscapes with roads, parks, and police stations, but nothing would happen and I'd eventually run out of money. It was only when I figured out how to lay down power plants that my urban experiments began to grow and thrive, and the game quickly became one of my personal favorites. There's an absolute genius to SimCity 2000, which was Will Wright's second and final SimCity game before moving on to mega popular life simulator The Sims, and less than stellar cell-to-space game Spore. The game is 24 years old and playable through a DOSBox emulator, so one has to wonder, how does this once groundbreaking strategy game hold up? Super well, actually. SimCity 2000 arrived at an inflection point of technology and aesthetic in computer gaming. In the early 90s, city builders still looked a lot like this, and didn't offer much beyond what the original SimCity brought in the late 80s. Personal computers of the day were just barely powerful enough to handle 2000's extensive features, like variable terrain, underground views, and complex simulations. The game, true to Max's spirit, is wonderful to look at and full of charm, whether it's the bright color palette or the quirky newspaper articles. The diametric perspective, inspired by Japan's best-selling A-Train, would be a city builder standard for decades to come. To explore how well the game worked after all these years, I decided to build 2 cities. The first city, Tarantropolis, was built in the same way I'd build cities back in the 90s. I ground the map flat in the editor, then laid down zones as quickly and lazily as I possibly could. I turned off disasters so I could build without distractions, like expiring power plants, and managed to unlock the top-level arcology rewards in less than 2 hours, which is undoubtedly a record for me. I'll talk about those more in a second. I didn't cheat building Tarantropolis, except that I still knew how to play the game so well after so many years, but it still felt easy and pointless. I never got a feel for Tarantropolis' strengths or weaknesses, and without much in the way of unique geography, the urban sprawl felt uniform. It was never a challenge, even with only $20,000 in the bank to start with, so I decided to build a second city, which I called Mega Thing. Mega Thing was originally something I was just going to fiddle with and give up, but as I kept playing, I fell in love. The map was hilly, and since you couldn't build on sloped surfaces, this meant a lot of it was inhospitable without some extensive landscaping. Between the rough terrain, power plants that died after 50 years, and an unsteady flow of cash, I felt like I was being genuinely challenged. I issued a bond to survive and afford a new power plant and stadium, which ate up a lot of my town's income on the interest alone. But soon I was making it, and feeling really comfortable with the hills and valleys of Mega Thing's complex terrain. After 2 decades, it felt like I was playing SimCity 2000 properly, even if replacing my power plants was getting really annoying. One of the biggest reasons why I love this game over its successors are those arcologies, which are self-contained cities within cities. They're expensive, majestic structures that allow you to take cities from nearly 200,000 people to over 10 million. It granted SimCity 2000 an endgame when its arcology-free successors were just interesting journeys to fill the landmass with sprawl, something you were going to do anyway. 2000's legacy is cemented by its support, including 1996's crude but lovable SimCopter that allowed you to be the hero or villain of a prefab SimCity 2000 town or one of your own. This series' 1999 successor, SimCity 3000, also allowed you to import your SimCity 2000 files. Despite being a complete disaster when it launched, 2013's SimCity may be the closest we've seen to a return to formula since 2000 wrote most of the rules. Beyond EA's meddling, there are some solid design choices in the 2013 title. So solid, Paradox and Colossal Order felt inclined to lift them and laugh all the way to the bank with 2015 City Skylines. Don't worry, I'll be giving Skylines its fair shake, but that's for another video. Today we celebrate SimCity 2000, the best city builder ever, well, built. It's time for something brief. Do you like racing games? Do you like open world games in the vein of Assassin's Creed and Far Cry? Well, when you combine these two successful formulas, you get The Crew, a notoriously boring game from Ubisoft. The pitch is easy enough. You can drive the entirety of the United States from coast to coast. Now at first, I was thinking they had just ripped Google's map data and made a game out of it. But when I played it at E3, I realized it was a kind of abnormal caricature of America. That's fine, it's a big map. We'll talk about that more in a second. You play Alex, a hotshot racer helping his gang boss brother in Detroit. Naturally, your gang boss brother gets killed, and the FBI offers you a sweet deal to infiltrate your brother's gang and exact revenge in exchange for clearing your record. What it really means is you get phone calls from your handler after every mission as you slog through with your duplicitous Paul Walker-esque campaign. So anyway, that map. It's big. A trip from Seattle to Miami took 45 real-world minutes. Unfortunately, that's where all the good things I can say about it end. I realize the map is an exaggeration, but I really felt that French developer Ivory Tower captured Road Trip Americana, as if they rarely had more than postcards for reference. In spots, their recreation gave me chills, like when driving around the Los Angeles Convention Center that hosts E3, or blasting down an Arizona highway alongside high desert hills. The coasts are anchored by big cities, but there's hardly anything in between, and that was especially disappointing as someone who grew up in the Midwest. Pikes Peak is here with some insane radar dishes on top, but there's no Colorado Springs or Denver. Santa Fe and Kingman are here, but not Albuquerque or Phoenix. The Dakotas are pure ice instead of pure flat boring, so maybe that's for the best. The game seems to forget that most of the country is webbed by high-speed interstates at the most awkward moments, like when you transition to dirt roads in the south, or to a winding forested route between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. Also, what good are road signs if the game applies a motion blur as soon as it's close enough to be legible? The crew works hard to impress. There's a ton of information on screen at all times, and results pages are littered with numbers and progress bars to make you feel like you're accomplishing something. In theory, there's a lot of stuff to do, but a lot of it is locked behind your experience level, which is locked behind the story campaign. Those story missions can be especially difficult with mandatory first place finishes in just about every single race. This is especially noticeable if you hightail it out of town early and encounter a bunch of high level content you can't play with. But who am I kidding? None of these events are really great. Unchanged from my playtime at E3, car handling is awful, even with some helpful tweaks from the internet. Car chases involve memorizing your opponent's driving line and then ramming them at optimal moments. Races are rarely interesting, and the courses feel like someone just squiggled on a map and then failed to test it. Do you know how many times I tried this race into Chicago, mastering every curve, only to be repeatedly beaten when I clipped some car and the home stretch is dense traffic? This game was free with Xbox's Games with Gold promotion a few months back, and while I'm happy I didn't gamble with my dollars beforehand, they made the clever decision to hide the more creative events behind the Horizon-themed Wild Run expansion you'll have to pay $25 for. The Crew is barely a game. It's a sandbox with some incohesive mechanics in it, like the similarly misdirected Watch Dogs. It's a toy. You can race, or you can seek out hidden radar dish sites to uncover more events, or even fly up ramps in a monster truck. Woohoo. There's even a stylish driving system, but it's weird seeing a single in-game dollar popping up randomly on screen just for driving around. Like, cool. Thanks. The game's also not very pretty, which is partially understandable considering the world's scale. This game made a lot more sense when I realized it was produced by a bunch of ex-Eden Games folk who made the similarly lifeless Test Drive Unlimited games. The gimmick of driving around a full-scale version of Oahu or Ibiza in those games ran out quick, so why did we expect anything different now? That's a fantastic question. It's time for something brief. The Witness is a puzzle game from Braid designer Jonathan Blow, and I'm warning you now that I'm going to reveal a few random solutions, but nothing crazy. Reviewing 2 first-person adventures in a row is mostly coincidence because here's the thing, I suck at puzzle games. Surviving somewhat rational games like The Dig was impossible without Joe Ashburn's excellent strategy guide, and more abstract games like Myst were always impenetrable to my poor squishy brain. Still, I was interested in The Witness, but its premium $40 price tag held me back for the longest time. I realize Blow has a lot to say about the depreciating street value of video games, but if you're not going to offer me a demo for a game I may only get an hour out of before I'm skimming GameFAQs for answers, then you're gonna have to wait for my money. So I waited. And I waited, and now it's finally in my hands. The Witness is an adventure long in the making, and the love and care that went into its creation is obvious. This is a game about solving puzzles to activate other puzzles to activate frickin' laser beams. The Witness's many challenges follow the same scheme with a variety of tweaks. Throughout the world are powered slates, and on each surface you need to draw a line between a start and end point that can't intersect itself. The Witness teaches well with helpful tutorials that explain new mechanics on an ingeniously designed learning curve. The game isn't forcing you into pixel hunts or frustratingly abstract guess and test sequences. Well, at least not off the bat. While the world can feel restrictive at times to prevent you from making any fatal or frustrating errors, like accidentally falling off high places, it also gives you free rein to wander through its many biomes. Puzzles are grouped together in similarly themed clusters, and you're never held hostage by any particular problem if it's over your head. You're free to tackle any of the world's many brain twisters at any point. Some puzzles take clever advantage of perspective, others take advantage of the details of their environment. Still others require an attentive ear. The game is minimalist in everything it does, from its bright polygonal environments to its lack of narrative, to a lack of in-game help beyond the structure of the puzzles themselves and a few button prompts to get you started. Without a story or discrete characters being foisted on you, the game does great work enlisting your agency, which makes the exploration earnest. When a game doesn't have an opinion about who you are and how you should be feeling about what you're seeing and hearing, you can fill that space with your own thoughts. Mechanically, The Witness is an extremely efficient design at its core, no doubt plotted and locked down years ago, then polished to high heaven ever since. Aesthetically, the only knock may be that the frozen, Pompeii-ish characters you find stick out like a sore thumb in the game's wild world. I'm not afraid to admit that I got stuck hard enough in a couple of spots to enlist Google for easy help, but I don't feel great about it. The interesting part is that even though all of the game's solutions are easily available across the internet, I only needed the slightest hint to get going again. So many times I just needed to think about a puzzle in a different way than I had been, or differently than the game had been leading me to think. This may be the first game I've played since I was a kid where I kept a piece of scratch paper nearby to help me along, and thankfully I've been able to work through most of the problems by myself. It doesn't need to be overt like Professor Layton's hint mechanic, but if the game knows you are stuck in any one position for a while, a little contextual hint wouldn't hurt. I could also stop being dumb too. As of this review, I've put about 9 hours into The Witness, and I know there's plenty to be had that my brain can't wrap my head around yet. In a way, this and Firewatch make a good 1-2 punch of adventures with fundamentally different goals. This is a well-built and incredibly designed title that, thankfully, offers plenty of opportunities for me to learn and grow and ultimately win and push on instead of being bullied by the most bizarre and uncrackable puzzle designs. The Witness isn't going to convince me to dive into the deep end of Steam's puzzle catalog, but if you're hesitant about plunking down the dollars like I was, you shouldn't be. It's time for something brief. If the original Titanfall was a demo, then Titanfall 2 is the shippable release. This episode is going to focus exclusively on the new game's single-player campaign. It's the future, and you are a rifleman for a vast political faction. A step above cannon fodder, you're spraying bullets at agents of some fascist central power. The geopolitics of this universe have never really felt clear by any means, but not long into your battle, your friend is murdered, and in his dying breaths, he leaves you command of his bipedal mech, or Titan, BT. Now you're on the hook to learn the robotic ropes to take down a cast of evil mercenary bad guys and fascist troops alike. If you're not familiar with Titanfall, imagine Call of Duty with Prince of Persia-esque mobility and giant robots to strap into, offering a full second level of gameplay. Developed by Respawn Entertainment, a team made up of key heyday Call of Duty talent, the first game was pushed out quickly as an early Xbox One exclusive that also saw itself on the Xbox 360, and almost entirely as a $60 multiplayer mode. Granted, it was a really good multiplayer game from the masters of the modern multiplayer shooter, but if you were hungry for some offline story-based content, you're going to be pretty let down by the thinly narrative team-based matches that served as that game's campaign. With a few more years of development time and a few more platforms to serve, Respawn finally had its runway to launch a proper AAA shooter. Then Electronic Arts had the great idea to nest Titanfall 2's release between their own Battlefield 1 release and Activision's annual Call of Duty event, which means that Titanfall 2 has been largely overlooked, which is a shame because it might be the best game of the three. It's hard to take everyone's praise of this campaign seriously when you spend a lot of the second level in a sewer, but it's actually pretty solid. As a newly uncertified Titan pilot, you alternate between on-foot and Titan gameplay, and both are refreshingly different. As a soldier, you're mobile but weak. As a Titan, you're a deadly weapons platform with a decent dash at best, but this game really makes a case for playing the Titan that the first game didn't. In Titanfall, I often summon my mech just to serve as a standalone sentinel, racking up points while I parkoured up and over buildings, taking out other pilots by hand. Here, you can quickly change your Titan's weapon and ability loadouts, which gives you plenty of latitude to extinguish enemies big, small, or Austrian.
Not let him leave here alive.
With a big picture that's fuzzy about who's fighting who for why, the game's emotional fulcrum hinges on the growing relationship with BT. Although the game grants you the slightest agency to interact with your giant mechanized killer robot with dialogue choices, it still does a good job crafting the pathos between you two, whether it's when you're separated in a level, or BT doesn't understand a wry joke, or when he requires your trust before he throws you across a vast expanse. Beyond this and the game's search for a planet-killing mega weapon, the campaign largely feels like a series of set pieces strung together. Despite how big these events are, the campaign doesn't feel epic in the narrative sense, like the most disjointed Call of Duty game would, primarily because you never feel like you're part of that big picture. You spend most of the game with BT weaving through the levels without a support team. Still, some of Titanfall 2's individual episodes are unforgettable, like the moment you gain the ability to flip back and forth in time with the press of a bumper to dispatch enemies and solve puzzles, or watching the fabrication of a city block before your very eyes. All of this, including the game's slower moments, is augmented by how slick the game feels mechanically. Shooting up dudes and blowing up enemy Titans always feels great. Running along walls always feels great. This may be the only action franchise where platforming sections are encouraging instead of disgusting. The game performs at a constant 60 frames per second without issue and tackles big, beautiful environments with ease. That said, the AI is genuinely dopey at times, allowing you to get the drop on them pretty easily. While the campaign is an appropriate 5 to 6 hours, by the time you build an emotional connection to your pal BT, the game ends. Titanfall 2's campaign is solid with some incredibly novel ideas, but let's be honest, you're probably not going to plunk down money for a single player Titanfall campaign alone.